started this series a couple of weeks ago, You, Me, and Empathy, and just sort of confronting and wrestling with this sort of like this thing that we find in the overall culture of 21st century United States, in which there is actually like real life debate going on about like is empathy a good thing? Should we be practicing empathy in all situations? Are there situations in which empathy is wrong or harmful? Which seems like a bizarre way to sort of even enter into a conversation, but that's where we find ourselves. And so for the last couple of weeks, Ashley and I have been sort of exploring like the different dimensions of this and how, like, as we engage with the scriptures and specifically the stories of Jesus, do we find that Jesus models that empathy is only reserved for specific situations in which we actually very naturally find ourselves being able to identify with the other person? Or is empathy supposed to be this broader sort of meeting a person where they are, regardless of how similar to us they happen to be? And I think so far it's been pretty clear, like, oh, we actually, like, there are no situations in which empathy can't elevate us and make us better and make us more of who Jesus is calling us to be. So I have never been more in need of the ability to show empathy than during my second to last semester as a graduate student. When I was in seminary, one of the things, and I went to seminary at Baylor, which is in Waco, Texas. And one of the things that we had to do as seminary students was every seminary student is required to spend at least one semester working as a hospital chaplain. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now, I was bad at that. That was not that was not the class I did the best in. And basically what they do is at the beginning of the semester, you go and you report to the head chaplain, and the head chaplain assigns you to a floor. And basically they say, okay, you are on this floor. And some people got it like pre-surgery, post-surgery. There were all kinds of different, like there was the maternity ward, which felt like the easiest one to me. Like whoever got that one must have like bribed the professor. But I got the trauma ward, which was I don't know what I did to make somebody mad, but I got the trauma ward. And the thing about it, at this particular hospital, the way that worked was basically anybody who was there being treated for pretty much anything that did not require long-term care or surgery, that's where they ended up. And so I had people who had like appendicitis, but I also, I guess that does require surgery. I don't know what that guy was doing there. Like people who like got hit by a car or fell off a ladder, or one person got like shot in a drive-by. And so like literally just like whatever. And so they give you a piece of paper when you arrive for your shift that has all of the patients on the floor. And the only information they give you is their name, age, gender, and what they are currently being treated for. That's it. They don't tell you, does the person speak English? Because they don't always. Does the person have other things that they're not being treated for specifically, but you might want to be aware of, like dementia or something like that. And so all of those things were real. And so my first couple of my first couple of weeks working in the trauma ward, I felt so like literally every time I would walk out of somebody's room, I would think, well, I think I just made this whole thing worse for this person. Like they are like, it would have been better for them had I not come to work today. So, which is not what you want as a hospital chaplain. And so I was telling a friend of mine who had done this program before about like, I don't know what to do. Like I walk into somebody's room and I'm like the doctors and the nurses, they walk in and they've got like news or they have like new medicine to give or something like that. I had nothing. I'm just a guy standing there. And some people like do not have like their faith tradition is not what I am there representing. And so like, it's offensive to them that I'm even there. And so I asked my friend, I said, what do you do? Like, how do you walk into somebody's room and feel comfortable, like engaging them in the form of a chaplain? And he said, a thing I learned was, he said, I started asking, is there anything I can do for you? Like that was a good way to sort of enter in from a posture of service. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. And he said, and here's the thing, most people will say no thanks because you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse. They have family members who are bringing them stuff. There's nothing you can do, but it softens sort of the mood of the room. And so I said, that's great. So I go in and my my first hour of that was awesome because I would ask that question and they would say like, oh no thanks, but thank you for offering, and that would enter us into a like kind of that would ease us into a conversation. And then I walk into this one woman's room. It's maybe the fourth or fifth person. I'm feeling really good about the strategy so far. So I walk into this woman's room and I said, hey, I'm Rob. I'm one of the chaplains here. Is there anything? Do you need anything? Is there anything I can help you with? And she just looks right at me and she goes, I'll have a Diet Dr. Pepper with some crushed ice. So now I'm in a weird situation where I'm like, okay, one, I don't know if that's available here. Two, I don't know what you're being, I see what you're being treated for. It's like a broken leg or something, but like, are you about to have surgery? Are you receiving a medicine that is like, that this is going to react really negatively? So I have to go find this lady's nurse, like, which takes me a few minutes, and ask her, can this woman have a Diet Dr. Pepper? Yes, she can. Okay, second question, where can I find a Diet Dr. Pepper? Like 3 floors down in the cafeteria, I think they serve Diet Dr. Pepper. So I had to like go downstairs, buy this woman a Diet Dr. Pepper with my own seminary student money and bring it to her. And I spent more time doing this errand than I actually spent in this lady's room. So I was all that to say, I wasn't great at the chaplaincy. This was not my finest hour, because I realized, like in reflection, I realized the problem was overall I was way too self-conscious. Like I would walk in and my first concern was, how is this person feeling about me in their room? You know what I mean? And not, is there something I can do for them? What is their pain? What is their situation? What kind of thing are they struggling with? Are they afraid? Are they sad? Are they like, is there other stuff going on? Like none of those things were as important to me as, do I look stupid walking into this person's room? The thing is, though, I had friends who are awesome at this. I know people who are amazing at being a hospital chaplain. Like, if I was in the hospital, actually, I'll tell you, this is true. At the end of that semester, I did have appendicitis and I had to go to the hospital. And the whole time I was in the hospital, I kept thinking, please God, do not let a chaplain like me come into this room. So if I was in the hospital, I would not want me as a chaplain, but I have friends who absolutely would be great at, like, if they came in, I would feel a sense of comfort. I would feel a sense of hope and warmth. I don't bring those kinds of things into hospital rooms, apparently. But again, I have friends who are great at it. And the thing that makes them great at it is they're able to kind of leave themselves in the hallway and just enter in looking for, how can I meet this person where they are? Which the word for that is empathy. It's the ability to walk into a situation and mirror the emotional situation that's already happening and meet the person in the moment that they're experiencing, and helping them, and this is critical, helping them feel like maybe they're not alone, and maybe helping them feel like somebody else sees them and is feeling some amount of what they're also feeling. So that is basically what we're talking about. That is the nature of this series, is what does it look like to meet people where they are? What does it look like to sort of leave myself in the hallway and enter into a situation asking, what is this person experiencing in this moment? And I had a really hard time with that, but I realized, like, that's the job, that's the calling that we're invited to. When we talk about empathy, that's what it looks like. So there are several stories in the scriptures that we could look at, and there's one I specifically thought would be very helpful for us in this conversation today, and it's a story from the book of John, chapter 11. And so the setup here, and you're probably familiar at least with parts of this story. This is the story of Lazarus. And so what's going on in the setup of this story is Jesus has a friend named Lazarus who also has 2 sisters named Mary and Martha. And at some point, Jesus is not anywhere near where Lazarus is, but he gets word. Word has come to Jesus that Lazarus is very, very sick, and that he may not have much time. And so one of the conversations becomes, or the central conversation becomes, should we or should we not go? Should Jesus, and we being Jesus and his followers, should we or should we not go to where Lazarus is and be there before he dies and be with his family? And it seems like, well, why would you even have to ask that question? Well, the backstory of this is, the last time they were in this particular town, there were people who like actually did try to kill Jesus. And so the question of should we or should we not go back? You might imagine there were some differing opinions on that because, like, well, I do remember the last time we were there, they did try to murder us. So maybe we just send a card this time or something. And so that is sort of the central conversation. So of course, eventually the decision is made, we will go see Lazarus. Or we will go to where Lazarus is. And so in John chapter 11, verse 17, it says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So the reason 4 days is important is the belief was at the time in this part of the world, the belief was that if a person died, then that person's soul or their spirit would remain inside that person's body for 3 days. So basically, by saying it had been 4 days since he'd been put in the tomb, basically the writer is telling us that Lazarus is like all the way dead and not just like mostly dead. You know, any Princess Bride? No, yeah, there we go. So the writer is basically saying, like, just in case you were wondering, like, is he just like really like kind of almost a little bit mostly dead, or is he like fully like 100% dead? And John is saying like, no, he is 100% dead. And so in verse 18 it says, now Bethany, which is the town where this is, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Now this, at face value, this seems odd, right? Like, why would they not both go out, or why would they not both stay in? This is, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the story of Job. In the story of Job, there's a story of Job suffering and grieving, and his friends come and sit with him for 7 days. And this creates a tradition in Jewish culture called sitting Shiva. And again, you have to be incredibly careful when you say that out loud into a microphone. So they are, what that means is for 7 days, the tradition is for 7 days, you sit with the person who is a family member of the deceased. And and basically you aren't speaking, you aren't offering things, you aren't trying to like give them like helpful words of wisdom. You are just sitting with them in their grief for 7 straight days. And this is at this point, a thousands of years tradition in Jewish culture. And so part of sitting Shiva is you have to remain in the home. So the grieving happens inside the home with the family. So someone in the family is required or expected to stay in the home at all times. So both Mary and Martha cannot leave. Otherwise, everybody else will leave as well. So it is decided Martha's going to go out and meet Jesus. Mary's going to stay. It's customary for somebody in the family to stay in the home at all times, if that makes any sense. So in verse 21, it says, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So Martha is articulating something that was kind of a common belief at the time, which the resurrection of the last day. And this is the belief that there is something that will happen in the future, that basically at a certain point, all things will be made right and the dead will rise again, is basically the idea. And so Martha is saying, so Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, yeah, I know, because I believe in that too. So, and so Jesus seems to have a different idea than Martha does here. And so in verse 25, it says, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village. So notice, by the way, Mary and Martha have to trade places. So now Jesus had not yet yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. So the only reason, if you are sitting shiva with somebody and it looks like maybe they're going to the tomb, that's the time that you would go with them. You wouldn't just like go like run errands with them, but if they're going to the tomb, it's basically like the grieving is moving locations. So that's what everybody believes is about to happen. So in verse 32, it says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, which is, again, the second time we've heard this, right? So, and by the way, John, super intentional about like the number of times somebody repeats a thing. John is always looking for like the larger symbolic thing to say beyond just like what's the literal story that we're telling. There's always some sort of larger recurring theme that John is getting at. So twice now, that somebody has said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Then in verse 33, it says, when John saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then in verse 35, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man, keep this man from dying? Which now is the third time somebody has said, couldn't Jesus have stopped this? So 3 times someone asks, why did Jesus not stop this from happening? And again, when John does something 3 times, it's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. John is pointing out, like, this is a common theme in this story. People are expecting this. People believe that this is a thing that Jesus can do. So so what they're asking is basically, where was God when Lazarus was sick? That is the question behind the question. Jesus, if you had been here, this guy wouldn't have died. In other words, where were you when we needed you? Where was God when we were afraid? Where was God when we were suffering? And by the way, it is so noteworthy that it's always the people who are closest to Jesus who end up asking the toughest questions. Because, and this is a whole aside, but a lot of times we have this conversation of like, well, if you had more faith, you wouldn't have to ask all these questions. But look at, like, who asks the questions? It's the people who know Jesus the best. Who asks the hardest questions? The people who have the deepest faith. How interesting that our closeness to Jesus actually prompts our questions. So the question, of course, is, again, Jesus, where were you? We were suffering. Where was God when we were alone, when we were suffering, when someone was dying and we needed you? This is actually not a new question for this moment. This is a very, very old question. In the Psalms, there's this book of poetry in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. It's called the Psalms. It's just poems. And one of the poets in Psalm 22 writes this, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. People of very strong faith, writers of the scriptures, of these poems that have lasted thousands and thousands of years, are asking these questions, and we're still asking these questions. Where were you when I was suffering? So let's go back and look at verse 32 again. In verse 32, it says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. This is important language. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then in verse 35, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how they loved him. Jesus clearly knows how the story is going to end. Notice the inversion of what you might expect. You might expect Jesus to show up, like be so moved by the grief when he first gets there and then weep and then start telling Martha, I am the resurrection. right? But he does. It's in reverse. He gives her like this word of comfort. He gives her this thing of like, there's a larger thing going on here. And then he takes the time to stop and to weep. Jesus clearly knows how the story is going to end. Why does he weep? If anybody in the story could not weep, it would be Jesus, right? By the way, I'll go ahead and spoil the ending of the story for you. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Try and hold in your shock. So Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and Jesus clearly knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So why does Jesus weep? Like, what is the point of the weeping if you know that the story is going to end well? So, because I would argue there's lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is Jesus can't pretend like this isn't a big deal. Jesus cannot pretend like something broken and painful isn't happening here. And just because he understands that it will ultimately have a positive outcome, it doesn't mean that this moment right now, this grief, this sorrow, this pain isn't real. He's not going to pretend like, listen, if you had more faith, you wouldn't be weeping. Jesus weeps. And by the way, here, before he weeps, it says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek here for troubled literally means angry and restless. So Jesus, there is something stirring inside of Jesus, basically insisting this is not the way it was supposed to be. This is not what people hope for. This is not the best of what the world has to offer. It's not that Jesus just feels sad and he's crying. He's facing something that he feels is deeply wrong in the fabric of the universe. Death and grief were never a part of the original plan. It wasn't supposed to be this way. And when confronted with human sorrow and grief and loss, Jesus weeps. Not because he doesn't think it's going to come out okay. He weeps because it shouldn't be this way. He weeps because when faced with grief, what else do we do? And again, how the story ends is Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. But what's interesting, though, is John spends way more time confronting the grief and the loss than the event of Lazarus' resurrection. John spends way more time with the grieving than with the resurrection in this particular story. So the story is showing us that Jesus himself, with the knowledge of what comes later and the power to undo the loss entirely, Jesus still weeps. So if Jesus weeps when there is grief and when there is loss, does that not that not model for us the idea that possibly that's what we're invited to do as well? Is this not what empathy is? Is this not meeting people where they are, and not unlike a good hospital chaplain, leaving yourself in the hallway and meeting people in their own grief and in their own struggles and questions and sorrow, and not lecturing them and not being morally superior, not telling them, listen, if you had more faith, there's none of that. Jesus weeps. So the story is showing us that the invitation here is to meet people in their grief. In Matthew chapter 5, one of the things that Jesus says at the beginning of what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this. He says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I would argue there are so many dimensions to this one statement, but the idea of, and it's not like if you're mourning, things are going great. That's not what blessed here means. Blessed means when Jesus talks about to be blessed in the context of these passages, what Jesus is saying is you will have some sort of connection to the divine that perhaps other people are not connecting with. And so for those of us who mourn, there will be some sort of openness. There will be some sort of connection that we have with one another, that for those of us who refuse to mourn with those who mourn, maybe we miss out on that. A thing I've witnessed in specifically in church culture is a culture of denial Again, like the idea of, well, if you had more faith, this wouldn't be a problem for you. Or I remember I attended a funeral. Um, it as someone who's done a lot of funerals, it can be difficult to attend funerals where you are hearing somebody give a eulogy and they say something that is actively harmful, and to not like stand up and like say like I object or something like that. That would be highly inappropriate. But I remember attending a funeral for, it's a really sad story. It was a 19-year-old girl who had accidentally overdosed. And I had only met the girl a couple of times, but I was friends with her sister and brother-in-law, and so I attended the funeral. And I remember the pastor, while he was talking, he spent a lot of time basically saying, I know a lot of us are sad, but really our sadness, it's selfish. And because she is in a better place, she is not suffering anymore. And so we need to stop being selfish and to celebrate the fact that she isn't suffering anymore, which I understand that there is good intention in saying things like that. But man, to tell a mother and a sister and a family member that you are being selfish by being heartbroken about the situation, like that is damaging. Don't say that ever. But we live in this culture of denial. Like we foster it in a lot of Christian culture. And what this does, basically, I would argue, if you peel back the layers of what's going on when people say things like that, it reflects a lack of empathy. It reflects again, a culture of denial of like, look, your grief makes me uncomfortable. And so I am going to shame you for feeling grief, and I'm going to basically demand that you take your grief away. And then we will have a a less true experience here, because we're all going to pretend like we're not heartbroken at what's going on in the room. And so, again, it reflects a lack of empathy. It says, I would prefer to not feel grief. And even you feeling grief in front of me makes me uncomfortable. So let's just not, please. Does Jesus do that? Does Jesus call Mary and Martha selfish for saying, if you'd been here, this could have been stopped? No. What does he do? He weeps. He's troubled. He's restless. He is wounded on their behalf. Where is God when we suffer? Where is God when we grieve? This is a big question that we've been asking for thousands of years. But maybe what this story is showing us is that when we weep, where is God? He's weeping with us. The word for that is empathy. And if Jesus is able to embody empathy so naturally, does it not seem like empathy is something we should elevate as a virtue? Does it not seem like maybe this is an invitation to each of us to enter into the proverbial hospital rooms all around us and find a way to weep with those who weep? Back when I was a chaplain, um, there was one there was one day, like, of the entire time I was doing it, I felt like I always felt out of place. I always felt like I was an imposter taking up space for somebody else who would be better at this. There was one day though where I had what I felt like it's a good thing. I'm glad I was here for this. And there was a guy who when I got there, the head chaplain said, "Hey, this guy's been requesting somebody to come visit him." And he gave me sort of the rundown. And basically, what happened was, he there had been a home invasion, and he and his wife had been brutally attacked, and the wife had not survived. And so um, he was injured. He'd had, I think, one or two surgeries when he first got to the hospital, and they put him on my floor. And so he was there, and his adult son was there, and I went in, and the guy, you could kind of tell it had been less than 24 hours since he'd been brought in. And he was just in shock, and he just needed to talk. And just maybe it was the brutality of it, the shock of just like this person survived a thing that, like, statistically he probably should not have survived. And that, not only that, but his wife didn't, and he was there, he was a witness to that. And so and their attacker got away. And and so I remember sitting in the hospital room talking to this guy, and really all I did, I just sat. There was a little stool next to his bed, and I sat next to him, and he talked for about 2 hours, and I just sat there, and I barely said anything. I prayed for him at the end because he asked me to, but but really it was just, and I just sat there, and the whole time he was talking, I just I kept imagining myself in his position, and just the grief and the fear and the anger, of course, like, as sort of like the realization of what had just happened to him happened. And so just all of that, and every time he would kind of shift gears and move, I found myself just very naturally kind of going with him and feeling anger when he was expressing anger, and feeling sad when he was expressing sadness. And um and the thing is, he just needed somebody to sit with him and bear witness to his pain. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus weeps. I wish I could have done that more than once the entire time I was a hospital chaplain. Um, that was the moment that I realized, like, oh, this is why we need hospital chaplains. We need somebody to bear witness to the things that we're struggling with. We need somebody to sit with us in a room and to hear us express pain, and not like lord over us like platitudes and Bible verses, and shame people for feeling sad or grief or not having enough faith, but just to hear what's happened to a person, and to weep with people who weep, and to meet them where they are. And so this is this is empathy. This is what we're talking about. And when we refuse that, when we deny people that, we are refusing to enter a space as Jesus would enter that space. And so yeah, we can dress it up and say, like, well, we shouldn't feel empathy for people who do XYZ, or for people who haven't made the same choices that we would have made under the circumstances. Does Jesus do that? No. Jesus weeps. And anytime we take a position other than that, we've left Jesus behind. So may we find that we are growing in our capacity for empathy. May we find that we are able to weep, not just performative weep, not just to show that we feel sorry for a person, but because we are meeting a person where they are. We are bearing witness to their pain. It's not easy to do. Some of us struggle with it more than others, but that's the calling. That's what we're invited to do. Maybe this is why Jesus says the way is narrow, because this is a hard thing for us to do sometimes. But may we find it within ourselves to do that. May we weep when weeping is what is necessary. May we refuse to be callous or cold when people are struggling, when people are grieving, when people need to be witnessed, or to have their pain seen. Um, May we find that there is so much more empathy living inside of us than we even knew.